Our story begins in 1948, Boston, Massachusetts. A group of college examiners get together at a psychology convention. Someone throws out an idea. Wouldn't it be great if we had a common language, a framework, if you will, to help us talk about learning assessments? That's how Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues first got together and over the next few years designed a framework that would help make it easier to figure out what someone has actually learned. They decided that the best way to create this framework was to focus on educational objectives and observable behaviors of the learners. They decided to divide learning into 3 domains or categories: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. If these sound vaguely familiar, that's because in L&D we use simpler words: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. The cognitive domain, predictably, focuses on knowledge, how we acquire, recall, and apply information. The affective domain deals with attitudes, how we develop values, emotions, and motivation for learning. Finally, the psychomotor domain covers physical skills, how we use our bodies to perform tasks. All right, let's break it down in a way that makes sense for L&D professionals. Imagine you're designing a new training program. Bloom's taxonomy can be used to structure the learning from basic to advanced, like leveling up in a video game where each new level builds on the last. So let's start with a cognitive domain, the one you've probably seen most often represented as a pyramid, though Bloom never said anything about the shape, and the one we now usually refer to as Bloom's taxonomy. As I mentioned earlier, this category of objectives is all about how learners process and apply knowledge. At the starting level, remembering, learners just recall information. For example, a new customer services rep memorizes the company policies or the steps for handling returns. At the next level, understanding, they need to start making sense of it. Instead of just reciting the return policy, they can explain why it exists and what it means for the customers. In other words, they're beginning to connect the dots. At level 3, applying, things get real. Learners must start to use what they have learned. So instead of knowing the steps, they confidently handle a return in a real customer interaction. And this is where the hands-on practice is key. Level 4 is analyzing. This is where learners break things down and spot patterns. A more experienced rep might recognize common customer complaints and suggest ways to improve the process. They're not just following steps, they're thinking critically. At level 5, evaluating, learners are making judgments. They compare different approaches, weigh the pros and cons, and decide the best way to handle a tough situation. This is where they stop relying on scripts and start trusting their own expertise. Finally, level 6, the final boss level, is creating. Here, learners build something new. Maybe they develop a better workflow, write a customer service manual, or train new hires. This is where learners go from participants to innovators. And that is the Bloom's taxonomy. Now, we have to admit, knowledge is great, but it's not the same as caring about something. When you focus on both knowledge and emotion, that's when the learning experiences become truly transformational. That's where the affective domain comes in. Let's explore it with an example. A training module for first-time managers focused on feedback. At level 1, receiving, the learner is simply open to new information. A first-time manager sits in the training session, listening to why feedback matters and watching examples of good and bad feedback in action. They're taking it in, but they're not engaging with it yet, just absorbing. At level 2, responding, they start to show interest and participate. Maybe they answer a question, share an experience about feedback they once received, or take part in a small group discussion. They're no longer just listening, they're actively engaging with the learning. At level 3, valuing, they begin to believe feedback is important. Maybe they hear a case study about a leader who turned a struggling team around through great feedback, and they think, wow, I want to be able to do that too. It's no longer just an abstract idea, it's something they personally care about. At level 4, organization, they integrate this new belief into their leadership mindset. They start connecting feedback to other things they've learned, like motivation, trust, and communication. Maybe they reflect on their own leadership style and think about how they'll build feedback into their regular team interactions. At level 5, characterization, feedback becomes part of who they are as a leader. When asked to role-play a feedback conversation, they don't just go through the motions. They deliver it naturally, with confidence. They're not just practicing a skill anymore. They've made it a core part of their leadership approach. And that brings us to the last domain, psychomotor. Now, in full transparency, Bloom and his team never actually developed the psychomotor domain. But later, other researchers expanded on Bloom's work and created a taxonomy for physical skills and movement-based learning. And let's make this practical. Imagine you're trying to fix a tech issue. Maybe your computer is running slow. You don't know exactly what's wrong, so you start looking for help online. At level 1 perception, you start noticing the problem. Your computer is slow, videos are buffering, and programs are taking forever to load. You're aware that something isn't right, but you don't know what's causing it yet. At level 2, set, you decide it's time to do something about it. You open a browser and type in, "Why is my computer slow?" or "How to speed up a laptop." You're mentally preparing to follow instructions, but you haven't taken action just yet. At level 3, guided response, you find a tutorial and start following it step by step. The article says, restart your computer, so you do. And then it suggests check your storage space, so you follow along. At this stage, you're still relying on instructions and copying what's being shown. At level 4, mechanism, you're getting comfortable with the process. You don't need to look up every single step anymore because you already know that restarting helps, clearing cache is useful, and closing background programs can speed things up. You can do it with more confidence and less hesitation. At level 5, complex overt response, you troubleshoot like a pro. You quickly go through the usual fixes, recognizing patterns and identifying the likely cause without needing a tutorial. Maybe you open Task Manager, check the CPU usage, and adjust settings without even thinking about it. At level 6, adaptation, you adjust your approach depending on the situation. You realize the same fixes don't work for every issue, so you start tweaking your solutions. Maybe instead of just clearing cache, you go deeper into system settings or adjust startup programs to make your computer run faster. At level 7, origination, you're not just fixing problems for yourself, you're creating solutions for others. Maybe you write a blog post with troubleshooting tips, record a tutorial, or even develop a simple script to automate some fixes. You've gone from searching for help to providing it. Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. No, not this one. This one, the criticism. One of the biggest issues with Bloom's taxonomy is that it makes learning look like a tidy, step-by-step process. First you remember, then you understand, then you apply, like climbing a staircase, one careful step at a time. But that's not how learning actually works. People don't always follow the same order. Sometimes they jump straight into applying something, like fixing a tech issue by trial and error without fully understanding why it works. Other times they might evaluate or create something before they've technically mastered the lower levels. Real-world learning isn't a straight line. It's messy, unpredictable, and shaped by experience. That's why many educators see Bloom's taxonomy as a useful guide, not a strict rulebook. It helps structure learning, but it doesn't fully capture how flexible and dynamic learning really is. And by far the biggest criticism is that it's old. It was created in the 1950s, long before we had the insights of neuroscience or cognitive science. Today, we know so much more about how the brain actually learns, things like the role of emotions, the importance of retrieval practice, and how learning isn't always hierarchical. And that's something Bloom's taxonomy just doesn't take into account. If you want to know more about other learning theories, check out this video right here.